Hey everyone, it's Miss Schlevo again, and welcome back to my online video lessons. And today we are going to be talking about the Enlightenment. So, what is the Enlightenment? Enlightenment is basically just the age of reason. And one way you can look at it is if somebody gets an idea and you know how a light bulb goes off in their head, that's what it is. Okay, so the scientific revolution sparked the Enlightenment. Successes from the scientific revolution convinced educated Europeans of the power of human reason. Remember all those ideas that Copernicus had, Vesalius? This kind of made people think more, and they thought about human reason. Next, we're going to talk about natural law, and these are just basically rules of conduct discoverable by reason. If natural law governs things such as gravity and magnetism, then why can't we use it to better understand social, economic, and political problems? This is what people at the time period were thinking, so they decided to apply natural law to everything else. The first guy we're going to talk about is Thomas Hobbes, that lovely guy right there. He was a philosopher, and he basically argued that people were naturally cruel, greedy, and selfish. People are real jerks, is basically what this guy is saying. And if they're not strictly controlled, they would fight, rob, and oppress each other. And he also believed in this thing called social contract. And this is just an agreement in which they gave up their freedom for an organized society. Sound a little bit familiar? Basically, the idea of the government. And he thought that only a powerful government can ensure this, and he was a big supporter of absolute monarchy. And next we're going to talk about John Locke, who's basically just the opposite of him. He was also a philosopher, but he believed that humans are basically reasonable and moral. He believed that humans were born with certain things called natural rights, and these are rights that belong to them from birth. So he thought that these rights were rights to life, liberty, and property. I hope by now this is all sounding very, very familiar. And he argued that people form governments in order to protect their natural rights. So the government is there to protect people's life, liberty, and property. And he thought that the best kind of government had limited powers and was accepted by all citizens. And this guy Locke, he influenced Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. That's why all the stuff I'm kind of talking about right now seems really familiar, because our government in the United States is based on most of these things. You see, Locke had life, liberty, and property, and we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this guy really influenced our government in the United States. Next, we're going to talk about the philosophers, and the philosophers basically just means philosophers, and we're going to talk about this guy Montesquieu next. And he thought the best way to protect liberty was to divide the various functions and powers of government among three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Sounding pretty familiar, right? And he thought that each branch should be able to check on the other two. Remember, these were pretty kind of a little bit of crazy ideas at the time period, because remember, they had absolute monarchies where only one person was in control, and now this guy's talking about three branches where somebody should be able to check their power. So the ideas from these men were very controversial during this time period. Philosophers continued. The guy over there with the nice orange looking curly hair, Francois Marie Arouet, actually mostly known by the name Voltaire. He goes by Voltaire. And he wrote poems and essays against the French government. And he was imprisoned many times for this, and he was actually even forced into exile for his ideas. Then right under him is a guy named Diderot, and he wrote this thing called the Encyclopedia, and in there just explained ideas on topics such as government, philosophy, and religion. And this encyclopedia was read widely by people during the time period. Next, we're going to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That was my best French accent, guys. And he also believed that people were good, and that their innocence was only corrupted by the evils of society. So he believed more in nurture rather than nature, I guess you could say. And then in 1762, he published this book called The Social Contract. And in this book, it talked about how society placed too many limitations on people, and that the government should have the least amount of control. And he was a big supporter of majority over minority, that individual preferences should not make the government what it is or govern things according to what one person thinks. It should be about what's best for everybody in general. So he believed in majority over minority. Okay, so we just talked about a bunch of men. Now we're going to talk about some women. The Enlightenment slogan of free and equal did not apply to women, and the women on the left, Mary Wollstonecraft and Britain, argued that women were being excluded from the social contract itself. She called for equal education, and one of her main beliefs was that education could give women the tools not to depend on their husbands. That would make women independent. Okay, so we just talked about government. Now we're going to talk about economics. These things are typically closely related, and we talk about them a lot together. One of the new theories was the laissez-faire theory. Laissez-faire. And that basically just means hands off, if you translate it in French. But it also basically means to allow business to operate with little or no government interference. And next we're going to talk about the guy that's on the left, picture of him, Adam Smith, and he wrote this book called The Wealth of Nations, and he believed that where there was a demand, suppliers would seek to meet that demand. And basically both of these ideas talk about free trade and the market economy, which hopefully this is sounding very similar again. We have sort of a laissez-faire policy in the United States. We don't like it when the government tries to play too much of a role in the economy. So next we're going to talk about how these Enlightenment ideas spread throughout Europe. So obviously during this time period these ideas were pretty controversial, so they challenged a lot of what society believed at the time. Not everyone accepted Enlightenment ideas because they strayed from the idea of divine right, remember? So they strayed from the idea that kings derive their power or political legitimacy from God, and that nobody else could check on these people or give authority, not give authority, kind of check on them and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing besides God. There was no earthly authority for them, is what I was trying to say before. And the idea of strict social classes and a belief in heavenly reward for earthly suffering. So a lot of these ideas that these men and Mary Wollstonecraft were having were pretty controversial. A lot of writers who wrote about this type of stuff faced censorship, so people were trying to restrict what they were writing. But most of these ideas still spread in salons, which are basically just informal gatherings. Okay, so next we're going to talk about some art and literature. During Louis XIV's reign, most of the art was in Greek and Roman tradition or Baroque. And Baroque is basically just a grand, ornate style of architecture or art. A lot of the pictures were huge, colorful, and full of excitement. And a lot of them actually glorified historical battles or saints. On the right side over here, you have Aeneas fleeing burning Troy. And this is basically just a depiction of Aeneas carrying his father during battle because his father was injured. So this is an example of glorifying historical battles. And next, during Louis XV's reign, art and architecture took on the Rococo style. And Rococo basically just moved away from religion. It was more personal, and a lot of the paintings were lighter and elegant. On the right over here we have Le Déjeuner. It's basically just a family eating. So it's pretty different from what a lot of the stuff that we've seen before. Mostly the other paintings were of Mary and Jesus, and now we're kind of moving away from that during this time period. So the lives of the majority changed slowly. Despite all of these advances that we were having and all these new ideas, culture seemed to change very slowly, but in the 1800s, which is what we're going to talk about in the next unit, due to war and political upheaval, this kind of catalyzes a lot of change in Europe at the time. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll talk about this in class tomorrow.